Welcome. We will see how to configure the REST activity of our reimbursement process to integrate with the HR system. In this video, we will learn how to test an API with Postman and then configure the REST activity in BIZUIT Designer to integrate it within our reimbursement management process. In addition, we will assign the result of the API to an internal variable of the process, which will help us to validate if it complies with the established policy. Before configuring the activity in BIZUIT, it is essential that we test the API of our HR system to ensure that it responds correctly and returns the expected data. In Postman, we enter the URL of the endpoint of the HR system that validates if the employee is enabled to request a reimbursement according to company policies. We select the GET or POST method as appropriate. In this case, we will use POST because we send data such as their employee's ID. We include in the body of the request their ID of their employee, sending it as raw JSON. We click Submit and check their API response. If their API responds correctly with a status 200 OK and returns a value such as 1 or 0, indicating if the reimbursement complies with the policies, we can proceed with the configuration at BIZUIT. Now that we have tested their API, let's set up a REST activity at BIZUIT within the refund management process to invoke their API and capture its result. We open the refund management process and configure the REST activity. We give it a representative name, such as HR System Query. And double-click to open our configuration wizard. We paste the URL of the endpoint we tested in Postman. Select the POST method for this activity, as in the test. We define the data that their API needs to receive. In our case, in the body, we will select raw and application JSON. And we will write the corresponding JSON with the employee ID. We click on Test to test our activity and infer the result returned by it. And we see that it returns an XML with a responsive content node containing a JSON reimbursement available at 0. In the next step, we will have to map the process parameter employee number, for which we will modify our configuration screen using init for the employee number. Click on Next. And we will be asked to determine the parameter or variable that will be used to complete the body of the request. In our case, the process input parameter called employee numbered. We will click on Next and map the parameter employee number to the body text parameter of our activity. But in this case, we would be replacing all the required JSON with the value of the parameter row employee. What we will do then is to build a transform function to replace the written row employee of our configured body with the actual value of the parameter we are mapping. We click Next. And in our responsive content node, we will have the response returned by the API, which we will assign to the Vacumla policy variable. This variable will be used later in the flow to make decisions about approving or rejecting the refund. Now that we have configured the REST activity, we will run a simulation of the entire process. We will place default values in our input parameters and set a breakpoint in the REST activity. And right-click on the activity and select the option Toggle Breakpoint. Then we click on Execute. We see that the process stops before executing the REST activity. If we click on Continue, we can see the data received and returned by the activity. As we have said that the result of the responsive content node is mapped to the variable vPolicy_compliance, this variable has all the content returned by the API. This is not exactly what we need, since our vCompletePolicy variable must have a value of 0 or 1. We will then use a JSON to XML transformation activity that will allow us to parse the JSON returned by the activity. We stop the debugging. Drag the JSON activity to the process just below our REST activity. We will name it Parser Response API, and we will proceed to configure the JSON activity. What the activity needs is to know the format of the JSON to parse, so we will place an example JSON returned by the REST activity. And click on Test. We see that it returns us an XML with a node refund available with the value of the JSON node, which in this case is 0. We click on Next. And in the source data selection, we will use the result returned by our REST activity called QueryHSystem, and we click on Next. In the Source Mappings window, we connect our responsive content node with the JSON node expected by our transformation activity. We click on Next. And now yes, in the node reimbursement available, we will have the value 0 or 1 that we can map to our variable vCompletePolicy in the mappings of output. We test again the execution of the process. And we see that our activity of transformation from JSON to XML was executed correctly, assigning the value to the variable vCompletePolicy. As we saw, the integration of an external API through the REST activity in BIZUIT is a simple process. First we test the API with Postman, then we configure the REST activity in BIZUIT. And finally, we transform its result to XML through the JSON activity. And we assign the result of this activity to the variable vFulfillPolicy to make decisions within the flow. I hope this video has been useful to understand how to use external APIs in your BIZUIT processes. See you in the next video.